Tonight, we are going to celebrate the legendary career of Judas Priest by ranking all 19 of their studio albums. How does your favorite album rank? Find out next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. As you know, we are celebrating the historic career of Judas Priest, as they just recently released their 19th studio album, Invincible Shield. Ranking the top 19 Judas Priest albums of all time is going to be difficult. Judas Priest has some of the most legendary albums in the history of heavy metal. And so there's going to be some really tough choices along the way. But we are going to give you the definitive lists. All other lists step aside. This is the one. This is the top Judas Priest discography listing on the internet today. So without further ado, let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Let's start with ye old number 19. Coming in at number 19 is the debut album from Judas Priest, Rock-a-Rolla. Now this is very simple. This is the simplest one of the bunch. Judas Priest has released 18 heavy metal albums and one 70s rock album. Guess which one this is. The fact of the matter is, I like the heavy metal version of Judas Priest, and they just had not found their sound yet. Glenn Tipton had just barely joined the band. A lot of the songs were written for their original lead singer, not for Rob Halford. This is just not up to snuff with the other 18 albums. This is a clear dead last for me. Now, there is a little bit of nostalgia around this album recently, as it just turned 50 years old. And recently I went and saw Judas Priest on their 50 Years of Metal World Tour. In fact, I saw it twice. And in both instances, they played a song off Rock-a-Rolla as kind of a tribute to where it all began. So for a nostalgic sake, great. But as far as this being comparable to their other catalog, it's just not the case. If you do decide to check out this album, my favorite track is the title track, Rock-a-Rolla. It's got a jazzy little hook riff to it. And again, the beauty of this album is you can see the talent. You can see the great guitars of K.K. Downing and Glenn Tipton. You instantly are gravitated to that angelic Rob Halford voice. But again, just the style of music, not good. The production of it, not good. There's a lot better in the Judas Priest collection. So this is an easy one. Number 19, Rock-a-Rolla. All right, coming in at number 18 is an album I often see ranked dead last in a lot of Judas Priest discography rankings, and that is Demolition, the second studio album in the Tim Ripper Owens era of Judas Priest. And quite frankly, I think this album is unfairly and overly criticized. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, wait a minute, Metal Dude. You're ranking it 18th. You don't think that highly of it. Why do you think this album is overly criticized? And it's simple. There are no such things as bad Judas Priest albums, people. There are some that are better than others, but they all have great moments to them. And this is no exception. This album, I think, gets a lot of flack because there is some filler on this album. There are songs that I don't like. And I don't think it starts out exceptionally strong here. I find that my enjoyment of this album comes kind of towards the middle of the album, if not towards the end. So if people pick the album up and they play 2 or 3 songs, they could walk away without getting to the good stuff. What is the good stuff, you ask? Well, if you're willing to give this album a second try, I would start with my favorite track on this album, Feed on Me. I really dig this song. I think it's one of the better songs in the Tim Ripper Owens era. Subterfuge is also really good. Those are back to back. I think they're like the 7th and 8th track on the album. So you got to dig into this one a little bit, but I think you'll find some songs in here that are pretty well done. They also have a couple of kind of creepy ballads on here that are pretty good. So give the album a fresh listen. Get past the first 2 or 3 songs, and I think you'll find some songs on here that are worth your time. So again, coming in at number 18, Demolition. All right, coming in at number 17 is one of the most controversial albums in the Judas Priest discography, and an album that has been dividing the fan base for decades. That album, Turbo. Let's start with the good of Turbo. It has one of the biggest hits in the history of Judas Priest, Turbo Lover, a song that they still play as a staple in their live sets. This album sold well and really brought Judas Priest a number of new fans and increased popularity. The bad. This was clearly Judas Priest's attempt to become more commercial, to join in with the wave of glam hair metal that was going on, and reach a wider audience by changing their sound up and their look up to be much more, shall we say, popular with the ever-growing female fan base that really made the hair glam metal explosion happen. There's another thing about this album that I don't really care for. And by going to this glam metal style of music, they really simplified their songs. There's not a lot of epic songs on this album. A lot of very light, catchy tunes. But what I've noticed over the years is a lot of times when you get more simple songs that are more catchy, they have a shorter shelf life than some of the epic, more complex songs that you grow into over time. And so what happened, unfortunately, for Judas Priest is not only did they put out an album that at the time was very popular and very catchy, it also came at a time when heavy metal was starting to get heavier. Metallica and Megadeth had hit the scene. People were looking for music that was getting heavier. The thrash metal movement was in full throat. And Judas Priest seemed a little bit out of phase, a little bit out of touch with the times. Then their record company decided this was the time to put their double live album together. If you want to know a quick history of the band, they had approached their record label wanting to do a double live album right after Screaming for Vengeance. That would have been the perfect time to do it. They had a video recorded. If you ever get a chance to see it, one of the best heavy metal videos of all time. It is Judas Priest live in Memphis, coming again straight off the Screaming for Vengeance tour. But the record label said, no, it's not time for a double live album. Instead, they put it here right after Turbo. And while the music was very popular, I think it just aged poorly. And now there's a double live album that's going to bring this material back out again. As a result, I think Turbo drew the wrath of many, and their double live album was a bit of a flop. So it gets ranked way down here at 17. My favorite album, my favorite song, and I think the best song on the album, is a ballad called Out in the Cold. If you've never heard the song, or if you've avoided this album because of the glam elements to it, Out in the Cold is a fantastic heavy metal ballad and is by far the best song on here. Give that song a try. Number 17, Turbo. All right, coming in at number 16 is an album that I found to be a bit of a disappointment. Point of Entry. Why was this a disappointment? Because this was coming hot off the heels of the fantastic, legendary breakthrough album, British Steel, and Point of Entry just didn't keep up. Point of Entry, I think, is trying to be a little bit more sophisticated, maybe a little bit more toned down, maybe a little bit more appealing to the masses. but it just comes off as kind of dull. Like nothing really exciting happens on this album from a songwriting perspective and also from a production. The production on this is also a little on the dull side. Just seems to be an album that never quite cranks it up a notch. Now, my favorite song on this album, and one of my favorite Judas Priest ballads of all time, Desert Plains. Really, one of the things that can sometimes happen with Judas Priest, we'll talk about this a little bit, is it doesn't seem like they know what songs to promote on albums. Their first video here that they put out was Hot Rockin', which I can see why they did it. It seemed like they were trying to get a hit song out of that, but they put together kind of an odd video. The guy's running around in a shower at one point. Their second video was Head Out on the Highway, which is the second best song, and I thought they really did a good job of, that video. It shows them racing around, getting, into some muscle cars, doing some things. And then when they showed the band, they had this like desert background. Desert Plains is a song about Halford on his motorcycle heading across the Arizona desert, heading back home to the loved ones. It seems like they could have really done something cool here by starting out with Head Out on the Highway and then did a video for Desert Plains, because those two songs seem to mesh. And by far, they're the two best songs on the album. But overall, this is a fine album. There's just not a lot going on this album, to tell you the truth. Now, if you want a real deep cut, the last song on the album, surprisingly, kind of really the only lively song on here, On the Run. Not only is it a little bit faster and has a little juice to it, but there's some great vocals from Rob Halford on this as well. So give it a try. But again, I think there's a lot more exciting albums in the Judas Priest discography. In fact, this is a good time to take a bit of a break, as the next 15 albums are the 15 albums that I love the most. These albums that we've talked about so far have been kind of the meh part of the album collection. Everything from here on out is going to be good to very good to excellent to Hall of Fame. And so it gets a little bit tougher to differentiate moving forward. As I mentioned before, we're now in the top 15 Judas Priest albums of all time, and I love every single one of these albums. It gets really tough to differentiate. But at number 15, I'm going to go with Jugulator, the very first studio album featuring Tim Ripper Owens. I want to rate this album higher, but it's just hard to get across all these great albums. The reason that I would rank this a little bit lower, it is a little bit uneven. It has great moments and it has some cringy moments. I give credit where credit's due, though. Judas Priest could have come in and mailed it in, hey, we're Judas Priest, but instead they went out with a very experimental, brave album. Like, they took some real chances on this album, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But you can never say about this album that they were playing it safe. They have some fantastic songs on this album. One of my favorite, I'm going to go all the way here, one of my top 10 Judas Priest songs of all time, Cathedral Spires. Oh my goodness, that intro gives me goosebumps to this day. One of the most powerful intros in the history of metal. Bullet Train's also very good, was nominated for a Grammy, I believe. I love Burn in Hell. These are some really good songs. If you've never heard Jugulator, I know it's kind of hard to find. It's out of print. It's not one that Judas Priest puts out there for whatever reason. If you get a copy of it, those three songs in particular would be where I start. Now, one of the things that people will note about this album, and it's obvious, it doesn't have Rob Halford on it, so therefore people rank it lower. And it's funny, I'm doing somewhat the same thing, but it's not because Halford's voice isn't on this album. It's because Halford's songwriting is not on this album. The lyrics of this album at times can be a little bit sophomoric, a little bit raw. I love the song Dead Meat. I love the song Death Row, but the lyrics are a little bit simple. So they miss Rob Halford's lyrics in this album, but again, I love it. It's one of those albums that just, it grows on you. And at times you're even embarrassed. Sometimes you like some of these songs, like Dead Meat is a pretty ridiculous song when you look at it on the surface, but it really just rocks. So coming in at number 15, Jugulator. Coming in at number 14, Angel of Retribution. Rob Halford, of course, had left the band to go off and join the band Fight. Tim Ripper Owens had come in for a couple albums, but things weren't going really well for either of them. So they got back together. This was that album. This was their big comeback, and it is an amazing album. I think the perfect song for a Judas Priest comeback has to be Judas is Rising. Again, one of my top 10 Judas Priest songs of all time. It is the perfect song on this album to declare to the world that Judas Priest and Rob Halford are back. Another really good song on this is Revolution. This is a very good song. However, again, I think something might be missing. They didn't quite have that instant chemistry that they had had before. It took a couple albums to get that going again. But this is a great album, and it was really so cool when Judas Priest came back with such a well-received and, quite frankly, kick-ass album. So, number 14, Angel of Retribution. Let's face it, there is no way to get through these last 13 without tripping on a few landmines here and there. This may be the first of those. Coming in at number 13, Hell Bent for Leather. Now, I have seen a lot of lists rank this album as extremely high. One of the most acclaimed Judas Priest rock critics in the world has proclaimed this to be their number one album of all time. It's very good. It's very hard to rank at 13, but there's just, 12 albums I like better. Of course, this album has two of the all-time standard live Judas Priest songs. Of course, I'm talking about Hell Bent for Leather and Green Manalishi. If you have seen Judas Priest live over the years, you know that these are two of the crowd favorites. The sing-along part in Green Manalishi brings the crowd into the concert with vigor. And of course, encore after encore of Rob Halford riding out on his Harley and Hell Bent for Leather cranking in the background. So two songs that are trademark Judas Priest songs. And quite frankly, the rest of this album is pretty consistently good. Maybe more hard rock than metal on this one. Again, it's kind of an interesting comparison, but I really look at this album as being a little bit like what they were trying to do with Point of Entry. A little bit less metal and a little bit more rock. Songs like Rock Forever, really good, really moving. Killing Machine, also very good. They even have a couple of nice ballads on here, like Evening Star. Overall, I think, again, one of the problems you have with 70s Priest is the production isn't quite up to what we're going to see in the 80s and beyond, but there's no doubt that this album has two of the greats, and it is also got a lot of deep cuts that are quite good. So if you've never heard Hell Bent for Leather, give it a try. It is excellent, and it comes in tonight at number 13. Coming in at number 12 is another of the 1970s vintage Judas Priest albums, Sin After Sin. I really struggled between this one and Hell Bent for Leather. Very close, razor thin between the two. But ultimately, I think I like Sin After Sin a little bit better because, number one, the songs on this album are the hits, the big numbers are just so great on this album. You've got one of my all-time favorite songs, top 10 Priest song, The Sinner. You've got Diamonds and Rust. You've got Dissident Aggressor, one of the heaviest songs of all time, way ahead of its time in terms of heaviness. The drums on this album are terrific. Starbreaker, this Calling the Priest, hit after hit after hit. And while no one's going to confuse this album of being like having a modern production sound, very similar to AC/DC's Let There Be Rock, Roger Glover really does a great job. While it's a very raw production, it has absolutely captures the power of Judas Priest better than probably any of their other album productions in the 70s. Very raw, but in this case it works because Roger Glover understood that what's important with Judas Priest at this time is displaying that raw power. So coming in at number 12, Sin After Sin. It's always difficult to get that number 11 slot just outside the top 10. And this one may be a little controversial. I've seen this album a lot higher on a lot of different lists. But coming in at number 11, Defenders of the Faith. This is, again, a fantastic album. Two of my all-time favorite songs. Both have got to be in the top 10. One of these songs probably in my top 2. It is arguably the best Judas Priest song ever written, The Sentinel. But Free Wheel Burning's not too far behind. These are two unbelievable tracks, and really this entire album is very good. It has another big hit song, very similar to You've Got Another Thing Coming, with Heads Are Gonna Roll. Well, the list goes on and on. This is an excellent album. Again, hard to understand how good these top albums are, that there's 10 more albums to come after this one that are even a little bit better. But make no mistake, this is a fantastic album. And again, it comes in at number 11, Defenders of the Faith. All right, the top 10 Judas Priest albums of all time. Coming in at number 10, we're going back into the 70s for the crushing classic, Stained Class. This is a very heavy album, very ahead of its time. This song starts off flying with the song Exciter. Again, one of the best Judas Priest songs of all time and a staple in their live shows for many years. This is considered by many to be one of the very first speed metal songs ever written. Judas Priest also had a stretch through here in the 70s where every album had just a fantastic and surprisingly worked well cover. So, for instance, on Helmet for Leather, you have Green Manalishi, which was a Fleetwood Mac cover. On Sin After Sin, you have Diamonds and Rust, which was a Joan Baez cover. And here, you have the cover of the Spooky Tooth classic, Better By You, Better Than Me. These are some very odd choices, and in each case, Judas Priest knocks it out of the park. A great cover. What an opening riff to this song. Love it to death. This song also features, in my opinion, the best Judas Priest ballad ever written, Beyond the Realms of Death. If you've never heard this song, take a listen. This is what a heavy metal ballad tries to be. This is great stuff. So coming in at number 10, Stained Class. Coming in at number 9 is an album that's ranked a little lower by a lot of people, but I think I know the reason why. Number 9, Ram It Down. I think the reason that this album is panned a little bit is, number one, We've talked about how much better Judas Priest is with really good drumming. This is right before they made the switch. They're using drum machines at times. It's pretty clear that Dave Holland at that point is kind of checked out. So the drumming on this album is not great. It does have synthesized guitars, which are a little bit controversial. I'm not really a big fan of the synthesized guitars, but they do them well here. And finally, they made a very bad marketing decision on this album and led with the single Johnny Be Good and attached it to a really bad Anthony Michael Hall movie that flopped. Now, the story behind this is that on the previous album, Turbo, Judas Priest was approached to be in the Top Gun soundtrack and turned it down. Well, Top Gun went on to, be one of the greatest movies of all time, biggest sellers, and Judas Priest, the soundtrack went on to also have great fame and fortune, and Judas Priest missed that boat completely. So they compounded their mistake a couple of years later by associating themselves with the Johnny B. Good film. And again, instead of leading with a really solid heavy metal song, they took the Chuck Berry cover and ran with it. Johnny B. Good, in and of itself, is a pretty good song. If you're looking at the fifth or sixth song on an album, I like it, but it's not the way you're going to bring people back, especially after a few years of Turbo starting to, get old and people thinking that Judas Priest had lost their edge. But having said that, if you can get past their bad marketing, this is a great album that overcomes all of these issues. The album starts with a banger, Ram It Down. The title track is fast, it's furious, it's got attitude. It's followed by songs like Heavy Metal, my personal favorite, Come and Get It, Hard as Iron, and the epic Under Blood Red Skies. There's also a very fun song, a little bit of S&M for the boys with the song Love You to Death, complete with whip cracking in the background. There's a few songs on here that aren't great, but overall, again, the great songs on this album overcome all of that, and it sneaks into the top 10. Number 9, Ram It Down. Maybe one of the reasons that you checked out this video is you're curious to see where the new Judas Priest album Invincible Shield would show up. Well, here it is at number 8, Invincible Shield. Now, I will be the first to admit this could be recency bias. This album over time could move up a few slots, go down a few slots, but I'm pretty sure this is going to stay pretty much in this area regardless. Invincible Shield is one of those albums that has like 10 very good tracks on it, a couple of mid songs, but this thing is fast, it's heavy, it's got everything you want. If you want a full review of Invincible Shield, check out the video in Circling Above My Head. We reviewed it in depth last week. No sense in going through it again, but it's a very good album, and just again, an amazing accomplishment for a band that's been around for 50 years. To come out as heavy as they came out on this album is a testament to just how skilled and how long-lasting the Priest legacy has gone on. So number 8, Invincible Shield, the brand new album by Judas Priest. Speaking of newer albums, coming in at number 7, Judas Priest, Firepower. Now, there are times over the course of Judas Priest's career where they had defining albums that brought them huge amounts of popularity. One of those albums is Firepower, which is universally hailed as a big comeback for them. A lot of people started noticing Judas Priest and were amazed at how good Judas Priest sounded after all these years. And with good reason. This is one of the heaviest Judas Priest albums of all time. It moves. It starts out with the title track, Firepower, and breaks into Lightning Strike right out of the gate. Two of the heaviest, fastest songs in their catalog. But there's so many good songs on here. Children of the Sun, tremendous song. Spectre, Traitor's Gate, Flamethrower. The list goes on and on. This album is heavy. It's fast. It's modern sounding. It's the first album, I believe, that they did with producer Andy Sneap, who also did the most recent Invincible Shield. He has a very great sound for vintage heavy metal. And you can see in that production, the band's never sounded better. Love this album. And again, a big comeback that really brought Judas Priest back into the spotlight. So it's not only a great album, but it's an album that is defining of their career. So coming in at number 7, Firepower. All right, break out the tomatoes and the small cabbages. I know this one's going to get some controversy. Coming in at number 6, the much maligned but fantastic album, Nostradamus. Now hold on a minute, hold on, before you launch those vegetables my direction. Let me just say, I don't know why this album gets so much hate. It is an absolute genius album. Maybe one of the issues that people have with this album is because in this album, much maybe like Nostradamus himself did the Quatrains, a lot of these songs are tied in pairs. So it's not just an album that has, several different individual songs, but it also has 2 songs that kind of are tied together. Maybe that's it. If your criticism of this album is it's because it's too long, fine. I can't defend that. It's a double album. That's a lot of music. But to me, criticizing an album for being too long is a lot different than, a line waiting to go to the bathroom. That's annoying to have a long line. If you have an album with tons of good music on it, I don't see that that's a bad thing at all. But it is a double album. It does have a lot of music. Some of the highlights on this album, if you're interested in taking a gander at it, I'll be honest with you, I avoided this album for a long time. When it came out, I heard nothing but terrible reviews penning it. And so at the time, I didn't really feel like spending money on a double album that everybody said was terrible. It wasn't until afterwards that when I heard some of their newer stuff that I went, this is really good. Maybe go back to Nostradamus, see how that was. And then I was just so amazed at how good this album is. This is the last album with original guitarist K.K. Downing. If you're interested in how to describe this album, it's like symphonic metal. It is a rock opera. It is a concept album revolving around the life of philosopher and predictor of the future Nostradamus, which is amazing to me because, generally speaking, although I seem to have the kind of profile that would like symphonic metal, I really don't. If symphonic metal sounded this good, I would be a much bigger fan. That's how much I like this album. I will direct your attention, if you want to give this a try, my favorite part of the album, Sands of Time and Pestilence and Plague is one of those 2 combos. Sands of Time is kind of this nice little intro, and then Pestilence and Plagues is the where the song really kicks in. And listen, guys, it rocks. It has a great heavy metal gallop, and it has Rob Halford singing in Italian. I bet you didn't have that on your bingo card. Great stuff. There's some other tracks. Death is kind of a standalone song that's very good. Another pairing is Isolation and Exiled. Those are very good. I like the title track, Nostradamus, the Prophecy alone. These are all really great songs. The list goes on and on. If you were scared off by people criticizing this album, give it a try. Know that it's not like any other Judas Priest album. Know that it's not anything like the usual heavy metal 80s style music. Again, I would characterize it more symphonic, more orchestrative, if that's even a word. But it is excellent. And I'm stunned that more people don't like this album. It is genius. And I think we need to have a campaign to restore people and talk the Priest into doing this one on tour. That would be so fantastic. Just the entire Nostradamus album. I know. People are like, what are you talking about? I love this album. So coming in at number 6, the much maligned, very underrated. Give it another try, Nostradamus. If you followed the entire career trajectory of Judas Priest, you will know that they are one of the most erratic bands in history. Up, down, all around, Judas Priest has had a very inconsistent background. And so there's albums in their catalog that turn things around. This song, coming in at number 5, this album is the poster child for turning things around. Number 5, the immortal album, Painkiller. Now, if you were around in the late 80s, you would know that Judas Priest was at a low point. While Turbo had sold very well, it had also soured a lot of longtime fans. At a time when Judas Priest went commercial and joined up with the glam and hair metal movement, the rest of the heavy metal world was going heavier. Thrash metal was starting to come on the scene, and people were starting to go towards Metallica and Megadeth. And Judas Priest looked like they were behind the times. Not only that, they got involved in a lawsuit in which lawyers were trying to proclaim that Judas Priest had caused the death of some young men who were listening to their music while they attempted suicide. And then Judas Priest made, in my humble opinion, the most pivotal decision. They went out and they got themselves a new drummer by the name of Scott Travis. Scott Travis is a very good drummer and the perfect drummer for Judas Priest. Judas Priest went from a very good heavy band to an unbelievably heavy metal band, and thus Painkiller was born. And while people were saying Judas Priest was over, they were yesterday's news, Painkiller proved all the critics wrong and had people running back into the Judas Priest camp. The title track and the first video off this is still one of the most watched videos for reactions. It is a sonic assault. It is so fast, it is so heavy, and it has so much anger and attitude. And it's not even the best song on the album. My favorite song is this creepy, haunting, spooky Touch of Evil. If you've never heard this song and you're a fan of that kind of creepy type of music, Touch of Evil, man, it hits the spot. But there's so many good songs with this. You know, another song I really like, and it's not one that's talked about. I'll give you a deep track on this one. All Guns Blazing. Woof! That song rips. Has a great vocal intro by Halford, and then it just tears it up. Again, Priest was yesterday's news, and with one album, turned it around. This is one of those pivotal albums that is why we still have Judas Priest today. Coming in at number 5, gotta love it, Painkiller. All right, coming in at number 4, we're going all the way to almost the beginning. Sad Wings of Destiny was a monumental album, and it was a game changer in the heavy metal community. It could be argued that before this album came out, there was basically one heavy metal band of note, that being Black Sabbath. A lot of the rest of the early 70s bands that may be considered heavy metal today are mostly considered hard rock. Sabbath was metal. Sabbath had one guitar. Sabbath had a very doomy, slow riff approach to heavy metal. And then came Judas Priest. Now, the first album we talked about, it's at the very beginning of this video, was like a 70s rock album. But here, in Sad Wings of Destiny, Judas Priest found their voice and became a heavy metal band. This is when you start seeing the dueling guitars, the faster, more intense, very different from Sabbath. But if you look at, the number of bands that are around today, most follow the Priest model more so than the Sabbath model, because it took that heavy metal away from a purely bluesy point of perspective and a doomy, slow perspective to a fast thrash metal, speed metal. All of that comes off the Judas Priest branch. It is a groundbreaking album. Now, you may argue, groundbreaking or not, is this the best? Does it deserve to be at number 4? Well, here's where I'm going to cheat just a little bit, because it's my list. Let's take that groundbreaking album with its production issues and turn it into a live album. Because if you take the not 1, 2, 3, but 4 fantastic songs on this album, we find it a few years later in Unleashed in the East with live versions that are the definitive versions of these songs. Let's talk about Victim of Changes. If you want to show someone the power of Rob Halford's voice, go to Unleashed in the East and pull up Victim of Changes. Oh my, it kind of upsets me. I watch some of these videos where people are, reacting to different heavy metal songs. And it's always a shame, because invariably people hear, ooh, Victim of Changes, great song, and they go to the US Festival in 1983 and pull that video up and react to that. And while it's fine, it's also obvious it was like 110 degrees in LA that day. It was a big, huge arena, and it's not, no one had a great performance that day. These were all very good performances, but if you really want to catch Judas Priest at their best, go to Unleashed in the East and pull this one up. There's 3 other songs. The Ripper, which becomes, an all-timer. It's been in their set for probably most of the 50 years of their existence. But 2 very underrated songs that, especially on this live album, are fantastic. Genocide, and oh my goodness, a top 10er for me, Tyrant. If you've never heard the song Tyrant, I highly recommend that song. Very good. Those are the big 4 songs that come off of that album. And because it's groundbreaking, and because this is the very moment that Judas Priest finds their identity as a heavy metal band, I got to put it this high, but I'm going to cheat and say, go listen to it, and then you can put that album on the shelf and go listen to these songs from the much better produced live album about 5 years down the road. So coming in at number 4 with a wink to the live album that comes after it, Sad Wings of Destiny. The album coming in at number 3 may surprise some people, but make no mistake, Redeemer of Souls is a well-deserving, awesome, epic album. This Again, one of those turning points in Judas Priest's career. This is where we see K.K. Downing's exit from the band, and we see Richie Faulkner come in and really breathe some life into Judas Priest, where the music gets much heavier. I would take the first 5 songs off this album against any in the Judas Priest collection. Dragonaut, the title track, Halls of Valhalla, Sword of Damocles, and one of my favorite Judas Priest songs of all time, March of the Damned. You talk about an infectious riff. Go listen to March of the Damned. It'll have you banging your head and humming to this bad boy for days. And it doesn't stop there. There's other great songs all through this album. I like the song Crossfire. You find it a little bit later in the album. It's almost like a heavy metal Stevie Ray Vaughan, kind of bluesy, kind of dirty kind of song that it's a real surprise. You don't see a lot of that. One of the things I really like about modern day Priest, we talk about this again on my album review of Invincible Shield, is while Judas Priest has gotten heavier, they haven't rested on their laurels, and they have so many surprises in these newer albums where they take some chances that actually just work. Crossfire is a very interesting song and an example of that. Another song I really like is Battle Cry. And I was mentioning this again on my Invincible Shield album because I find this fascinating. Rob Halford, at this point, it seems like his voice is starting to, he's starting to have issues with it. And so the way he sings Battle Cry is kind of where you start to say, okay, this is the new Rob Halford. And what's amazing to me is even from that point of that album going forward, it seems like his voice has even grown stronger. Amazing stuff by Rob Halford. I fell back in love with Judas Priest after listening to this album. I was blown away. This is like, if this would have been a follow-up to, say, Screaming for Vengeance, if this would have been done in the 80s, it would have just been at the top of the charts. If, for whatever reason, you lost touch with Judas Priest after they broke up with Painkiller, which is completely understandable. They were off the charts for many years, and you didn't get in on this new stuff. Please do yourself a favor. Go listen to their new stuff. It is powerful. It's fresh. It's vibrant. This album rocks from start to finish, and it comes in at number 3, Redeemer of Souls. Whenever you do a list like this, there's always going to be a few controversial picks. A few albums people say, I can't believe you've made that so high, or I can't believe you ranked that so low. But when it comes to the final 2 songs, I pretty much am going chalk here. The only remaining question is which one's number 1 and which one's runner-up. And it kills me to put either of them in the number 2 spot. These are 2 of the best albums that touched my life, why I'm a metalhead today. Coming in at number 2 was my gateway into Judas Priest. The classic British Steel. This is the album that broke Judas Priest big in the United States, and with good reason. Now, I see a lot of people out on the internet kind of bad-mouthing this album, and I know why. In 1980, Judas Priest broke big, and they had 2 very big songs off this album. One of those songs, Living After Midnight, the other, Breaking the Law. Classic rock radio. If you hear, like you're running around and you hear next up Judas Priest, 99% of the time it's going to be one of those 2 songs. Huge hits. Very similar to Black Sabbath's Paranoid album, where if you hear an old Black Sabbath song on the radio or whatever, it's generally going to be, the big three: War Pigs, Paranoid, Iron Man, almost always. Same thing for Judas Priest. It's like the rest of the collection didn't exist. Oh, every great once in a while you'll hear Painkiller. Every great once in a while you'll hear another thing coming. But generally speaking, they're going to play Living After Midnight or Breaking the Law. So people have gotten tired of these two songs. And nowadays, where bands are allowed to just be as heavy as they want to be, people don't realize that back in the day, record labels were really putting emphasis on bands to have hit singles, radio-friendly singles. And this is the case here. Judas Priest had to put out singles in order to satisfy the record labels. And if you look at user-friendly, if you look at radio-friendly music that came out, these two songs are excellent. Especially Breaking the Law. I, too, have grown tired of Living After Midnight. I, too, usually skip it when I'm listening to this album. But Breaking the Law is a classic Judas Priest song that the only reason it gets a lot of grief is because people have heard it 2 million times. It is really good. But if you're tired of those two songs, fine. One of the heaviest tracks in the Judas Priest collection, Rapid Fire, comes off this album, a trademark song that's been part of their live set for many years. Metal Gods is in this album, one of my personal favorites, and again, one of those Judas Priest top 10 songs of all time for me, The Rage. If you want to hear a really great Rob Halford sung song, go seek out The Rage. It starts out, it's a unique song. It's a very slow song, and it builds to this crescendo, and Rob Halford just knocks it out of the park. A couple of other songs that get a little grief. One of them is You Don't Have to Be Old to Be Wise. I get it. People get older and they're like, oh, those young whippersnappers, get off my lawn type thing. This is a really good song. And yes, it tackles the age-old question of, you don't have to be an older person to understand ththings. The lyrics in this are really good, though. Really catchy lyrics, really poignant lyrics. I love the line, take a look in the mirror, then tell me now who's been had. Really flaunting youth and vibrance. And I think it's a very underrated song. I've always enjoyed it a great deal. And finally, even though they're kind of out of vogue now, there is an anthem at the end of this album called United. But I do want to point out something. In the late 70s, and in this case, 1980, heavy metal was really under siege from all sides. In America, they were going to a much more commercial sound where they were looking at disco and kind of new wave music. Believe it or not, the Knack was a big thing. So everybody was looking for skinny tie bands and disco bands in America. And over in England, their home country, punk rock ruled the day. So you had the Sex Pistols and you had the Clash. And again, heavy metal was completely ignored. It was considered dinosaur rock. You couldn't get on the radio. So the heavy metal community had to come together. So you see in the late 70s and early 80s these anthemic songs that brought their community together. Another example of this is Denim and Leather by Saxon. And it worked because the metal community grew. And folks, for the next decade and a half, heavy metal ruled the earth when it came to music. Heavy metal was selling out stadiums and arenas all over the world because that heavy metal came together and said, we will no longer be ignored. You will put us on the radio. You're going to play us in clubs. You're going to, because there are people, there is demand out there for this. So you may not see the point of these anthems now 40 years later, 50 years later, but trust me, at the time they were very powerful and you had a sense of belonging to the metal community. I, for one, love the song United, and I remember thinking, wow, I'm really part of something special in the heavy metal community. So, British Steel, I love this album. Again, in my heart, number one, but I had to give it number two because number one is the all-timer. What can you say about Screaming for Vengeance that hasn't already been said? The greatest Judas Priest album of all time. It is a perfect album. It just rocks from start to finish. It has my all-time favorite, well, I guess you would say songs, because similar to what we were talking about with Nostradamus, Judas Priest puts two songs together to make an epic, one being more of an intro to the main song. And so, The Hellion and Electric Eye is my number one Judas Priest song of all time. Just a little background of myself. One of the first memorable concerts that I ever went to was Judas Priest Screaming for Vengeance. And the concert opened with this song. And to this day, I just remember Rob Halford coming out of the scaffolding, bullwhip on his hip, singing this song. And just, again, it changed my life. And here we are, 40 plus years later, still loving metal. But it doesn't end there, because you have good songs like Riding the Wind, Bloodstone, a very underrated, kind of a softer, maybe you would even say ballad, Take These Chains Off, really great. And then you have the super heavy title track, Screaming for Vengeance. Again, another one of my favorite, Devil's Child, Fever, really good, different kind of song for Judas Priest. And really, I haven't even talked about the big hit off that album, You Got Another Thing Coming. They put a video out for that, played it on MTV. That's probably the song most people are familiar with. I wouldn't even put it as one of the top 5 songs on the album. That's how good that album is. It had to be number one. And again, it's one of those moments in time where Judas Priest just took off and gained in popularity. This was coming off the heels of a pretty down album with Point of Entry. This, well, came back with a vengeance. The greatest album of Judas Priest's career, no doubt about it. And it had to come in number one. There you go. There's my list. If you disagree with this list, or if you do agree with this list, put your comments down below. I would love to hear your list. You don't even have to do the top 19 if you don't want to do the entire catalog. Give me your top 5 albums, whatever the case. Just put them in the comments. I love to hear from the listeners. And that's it for us today. Join us every Tuesday for another edition of the Metal Dude Abides. And so you don't miss a single episode. This is a great time to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, give it a thumbs up, and you'll really be helping us break through the YouTube algorithm. In the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. As always, take care.